Hello and welcome to Startup Shop Talk, our weekly live show all about startups and innovation from idea all the way to product market fit. And today we're talking about how to know when to do what when it comes to the startup and company life cycle. So as always, my name is Josh David Miller, aka JDM, and I'm here with my friend and co-host Dan Cassis Murray. Dan, good
Yo,
morning.
folks. I'm good. How are you
Lovely.
doing?
I am great. Happy Friday, sir.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. So let's dive right in. So we were talking after last week's show, and last week's show was all about the common ways that startups fail. And it occurred to us when we were talking about it that nearly all of those reasons that startups fail had something to do with timing, like with bad timing, with like things happening completely out of order. And that's because it's easy to find tons of startup advice. There's all these books and articles and videos that tell you what to do to accomplish certain things, but it can be difficult to find like really good quality information about when you should do those things. Not what you should do, but when you should do it and when you shouldn't do it. So we thought it'd be fun to talk about timing today, and I want to let Dan kind of set this up a little bit because we're just a little bit different. So I'm gonna do a little setup here. Dan's gonna do a little setup here, and then I'm gonna let Dan kind of just dump the magic that's in his brain out onto all of you, and I'm just going to facilitate and walk behind him like the guy who follows behind the horse with the shovel. So that's going to be my role in today's show.
The magic.
The magic. So and that's not my
Those are
way
mixed
of saying,
metaphors.
Dan,
What are you
it's
really
not
trying
my
to
way
say?
I'm not trying to say that you're full of horse shit, but it's unicorn falling behind the unicorn with a shovel. Okay,
Whatever.
so whatever, it's fine.
Just no matter what I do, I won't call you piss boy.
Well, I appreciate that. That would do something
Shout
to
out
my
to Mel
self-esteem.
Brooks.
All right. So just to lay the groundwork here a little bit, what we talk about with this idea of timing, there are so many books out there, like so many books, and about all this stuff about companies and great companies. There's even a book called Good to Great, and there's Principles by Ray Dalio, and there's just so many books about how to run great companies and how to do all this stuff. But the order isn't always right. The order isn't always helpful. And so just a couple of quick quips to say what I mean by that. You can have a book that tells you about all these awesome things to do for customers. Like, here's how you really serve your customers well. But how does that help you before you have customers?
Right.
And then you get other books that talk about like, oh, here's how you build a great team, and here's how you treat employees and build all this good culture. But what if you don't have a team yet, or you can't afford to have a team, or you got nothing for your team to do? Or you can read these books on sales that tell you, here's all these brilliant sales techniques, and here's how you build, a sales process and a sales culture and a sales team, and here's how you scale that and do all that. But what if you ain't got nothing to sell? And that's just on the startup side, and that's not even getting into like the books that talk about how to scale really, really big companies. It's not that these books are bad, but there's an order of operations problem here, and these books aren't sitting in necessarily the proper order. So we want to take all of this brilliant advice that's out there and put it in order. So, Dan, set us up a little bit here. Why does this timing matter?
Okay. Timing totally matters. Now let me break it down into two chunks. There's a startup and then there's a company. So Steve Blank says that a startup is a group of people searching for a repeatable business model. And that's what we do as founders. We're looking for products that will sell. We're looking for product market fit. We're looking for problem solution fit. Even before that, we're looking for people just to interview. And then after we have this repeatable model that's identified, then we actually have to execute it. And then we move into this place called a company. It seems elementary, right? But it's really easy to forget. So what is a company? Well, a company is a group of people that are executing that repeatable business model. And so we find like the books that we just talked about, that there are certain books that go into certain places, right? And when. So the idea is that in the very beginning, we're talking about this group of things that we always talk about. The conversations are typical, the words that we're using, the vocabulary, all that stuff belongs to startup land when we're trying to figure out what this repeatable business model looks like. But at some point that switches, and there's not really a hard delineation of when that actually occurs. It's kind of subjective, but you kind of know when you're there. It's when things like leadership start to make sense and resonate. It's when recruiting starts to come. It's when quality control, project schedules, like all those things. That's when that vocabulary becomes relevant to what's actually going on day to day. And so when we talk about timing, what we want to do today is say, okay, well, look, the startup stuff, let's talk about the startup stuff when it's startup time. Let's talk about the company stuff when it's time. And so here's the thing is, I don't know about everybody else, but I got one brain, and it doesn't even run on 100%. Maybe it's like 20% on a good day, right? And that's because I'm a little bit older, but like in my youth, it was probably only about 50%. Anyways, there's a whole other story about why it's not 100% anyways, but the idea is that I have a limited amount of bandwidth. Like, yeah, there's hours in the day, and then there's like, things that I can actually do with my time. But the bandwidth that I have is a function of, my brain's capacity to actually churn through, assimilate, and implement the actual information that I'm taking in. And so the question is, okay, well, I can't look at it all at once, and I can't understand everything all at once just because it's too big, especially as a new founder. So how do I make sense of this? When should I be reading the recruiting book? When should I be reading the company building book? Do I do that right away so I can avoid mistakes? Yeah, okay. But what should I be thinking about? Should I be thinking about like, oh, well, when I have a company, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. And that's kind of what we want to figure out today is we want to basically say, well, that's good information. Let me put it back here so that when it is relevant, I can access it later. But I don't need to do a deep dive into honing in my sales process or even optimization on a website yet, because I'm just trying to figure stuff out, right?
Right.
How's
Okay,
that?
cool. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So timing matters. Timing's important. That's all great. So let's envision this as like a journey. Like we got a big journey, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're trying to get from where we are all the way over to Candy Castle.
Bam.
All right. So we're trying. We know we got a lot of steps to go through to get there. We're trying to get from here to Candy Castle, right? We're trying to get to the end here. What does this journey look like? Give us the 30,000 foot view. I didn't tell Dan that I had a Candyland picture here.
He did it, man. I'm just like gushing on it. Oh my God, that's awesome.
All right, so but a more helpful one. This is what you put together, Dan. So walk us through your drawing.
Okay, so here's the idea. We see right there launch, soft scale, and company, and then we see sales and leadership there, right? So let's think about it like this. Let's say launch, soft scale, and company. Like, we're just going to draw a line in the sand. It can be arbitrary, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the way that you draw the line there. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that launch, soft scale, and company are in startup land. And then let's say that sales and leadership are in company building land. So if we go back to the Candyland slide, yeah. So there we are, starting off, and somewhere around 4/5 of the way through is where we actually start going into the company thing. But here's the thing: it's like steps 1 through 3, they have a definite beginning, middle, and an end, and we don't want to stay in startup land. Eventually, we want to get into company land, like with the sales and that leadership portion, right? And that's what we're finding, that for the rest of our lives, basically, we're executing that, or until exit, and then we start a new thing, whatever. But that is how it goes, right? So there's a lot of time spent on the sales and leadership part, and the what's not there is like the operations and like efficiencies and quality control and project management and all that other kinds of things, for which we hire MBAs and executives, right?
Totally. Okay, cool. So we've got this, just to recap here. So this, you outline this 5-step process. 3 steps are all about the startup phase. That's like figuring out what the thing is.
Yeah.
And then sales and leadership are all about making that little thing or that littler thing into a giant big thing.
Yeah. And it's like basically running your company. So if the launch, soft scale, and company, we're all in this mode of being a group of people that are searching for a repeatable business model. The sales and leadership milestones right there are basically people that are executing on that repeatable business model.
Okay, got it. All right. So let's walk through some of these then. All right.
Okay.
So yeah, let's do it. So start out. Step 1, launch, right? So for each of these steps, let's just go 1 through 5, all 5 steps, and we'll start with like, how do you enter into this step? Like, what is it? How do you know that you're in this step, right? Like, what had to happen in order to get here? And then let's talk a little bit about like what you do as part of that step. Let's talk about what you have to look out for while you're in this step. And then if you've got any, like, what are some cool resources that you can point people to for like, here's great information if this is your current step. And if this is not your current step, ignore it, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with step 1 launch. Like, what's the trigger to starting step 1?
Okay, so the trigger for step 1 is basically like, I think we all can relate to this one. It's like, hey, I have an idea.
Yeah.
Basically, like
Okay.
the twinkle in your eye, that book that looks cool, like the dream that you
Right.
you're losing sleep because you can't stop thinking about that one thing that is gonna be awesome, basically.
Okay.
And so that's the impetus, right? That's what gets us, and of course, there's all these other things that go into our culture, the stories that we tell each other, that we tell ourselves about, like, the entrepreneur's dream, the founder's dream. I don't know necessarily think that Americans have a monopoly on that particular dream, right? It's a worldwide dream. If you're a human being at some point, I think that it's plausible that you've probably thought about owning your own business.
Okay.
you know so that's the trigger, right? And so like, in this phase, what we're doing is just, for neophytes to the process, we're thinking about like, oh, is this idea even going to work? Am I going to have a business? Can I actually do it? So there's a lot of like personal development things that go on in here. It's like soul searching, it's understanding our passion, it's starting with why, that kind of stuff. And it's really introspective, right? And at some point we turn and we stop introspecting and we start outrospecting and we start asking
Okay.
friends and family, hey, does my idea suck? Right? And whenever other people are supportive and they say, no, it's not a bad idea at all, honey, that's my mom talking, right? That's when I have to get real with myself and I say, okay, well, look, would I be willing to bet money on this idea? And
Okay.
so you and I talk an awful lot about that stage, and as we should, because it's the beginning of the beginning, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And so we've covered this extensively in the live stream, and we're going to continue to cover it because there's a lot, right? But it's all basic, like, hey, do I have a thing? Is there a there? Um, to quote my friend JDM. And it's about setting up like little tests so we could place the next bet, all that stuff, right? So most of what we've been talking about is all in this launch category.
Right. Okay. Great. So, as we talk about that, you've kind of outlined the big picture, what you do in this phase, right? You said it's about looking for trying to find customers and figure out who they are, what they want, and do all that. So break it down a little bit more. So when you're in this, so you got an idea for something, you had this like cockamamie scheme, if we're being honest, right? And you want to end up with proof that there should be a there. Not that you know for sure, but like you got some compelling evidence that there's a there.
Yeah.
How do you get from cockamamie scheme to some compelling evidence?
Okay.
What are the activities that a founder does during that time?
Well, I think it would be helpful to use a real world example of my experience, if that's okay.
Great. Let's do it.
Okay. So it was back in 2010.
Oh my.
Yeah, a good 12 years ago. Wow. Anyways, so I'm in Iraq. I'm in Baghdad. And I'm a contractor there. And my idea was to basically figure out how to become independent and start my own business while I was in Baghdad. Brilliant idea, right? Cockamamie for sure. And so I knew of a guy who provided internet service to people. And so this was basically like, you go, let's say, for example, like the wireless internet service providers that we have right now, like you're off in the Sierra Nevadas, there's no internet signal right there, right? And you got to get a signal because you want your Wi-Fi at your cabin, right? That's the same idea, only Iraq didn't have the infrastructure to support any of that stuff. So what we did is we basically set up wireless radio shots. So there's miles between this two radios from which we're basically beaming internet signals from one station to the other. And that's how we provided internet access to people, right? So we're on this base And I get word that one of the internet service provider vendors was gone, and they needed another one to, fair and healthy competition, right, for the base. It was a military base, about 400 people. Actually, there's more about like 1,200 people that are on the base, but like all Westerners, all in this like enclosure, right aside from the U.S. Embassy. And so the cockamamie idea was that, hey, wait a minute, maybe I could provide internet service to these people, knowing nothing about internet, not really knowing my partner that well, but knowing that there was a need, and where there was a need, business 101, there's a market. So what I did is I put together this proposal for the person that was in charge of that entire base, and it was a PowerPoint slide presentation. It was basically like, hey, this is what we can do, this is how much we'll charge the people, and yeah, so what do you think? Right. So what are the things, like, so in that particular thing, like, what were the activities there? It was business intelligence. It was making sure that I knew what was going on, like, around, in the environment. It was making sure that I knew what people needed to do, which was communicate with folks back home. It was understanding like who the players were in that ecosystem, right? So who the community, like who was in the community, why they needed it, who was in charge, who wasn't, that kind of stuff. So it was basically just getting like lay of the land and understanding where the need actually was for that first phase.
Got it. Okay, cool. So Cockamamie Scheme for this internet service provider in Iraq, during which, for those of you who remember your recent history, things weren't brilliant and fantastic in 2010. So so this is your cockamamie idea to do this. And you started out by saying, let's figure out this is the thing people want. You put together a little PowerPoint, and then you went out into the real world and you started talking to customers.
Yeah, pretty much.
And so what did you like? So you went through this process. What did you learn like through that effort? What was the like how what did you obviously, okay, spoiler alert, like it worked, right?
It worked.
The business worked. So what were the signs that you were getting that that you were like, okay, I'm moving along this, I'm still on step one, but I'm moving along this process. Like what did you learn that was like, there's a there there?
Okay, so the first thing was that, I submitted the PowerPoint presentation, right? And then we heard nothing. And, from being in business development before, I knew, hey, if you don't hear anything back in like a week or two, you might want to just poke it a little bit just to see, follow up, that kind of circle back, that kind of thing, which I did. And I still didn't necessarily hear anything. And so what I did at that point is I went over to the office where the boss was, and I couldn't talk to the boss directly, because barriers, and I'm just a stinky contractor. And but instead I talked to the people that were there, and I'm like, hey, so anybody say anything? More business intelligence, basically just gathering more intelligence, understanding, hey, what's the context? Because obviously I didn't understand it well enough. And so they told me, they said, yeah, she had some questions, and it was more about the pricing and everything like that. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And they're like, well, this price looked like really, really high. And I'm like, but it's not high. And they're like, yeah.
The customer's wrong, damn it.
Okay, so the main takeaway was this. What I was trying to do was sell a big ass chunk. And what they really wanted to do was, they didn't have any problem like paying money for the service, but the chunk was way too big. What I had to do was break the chunk into like little pieces. So 6 1 half dozen the other, you may say, right? But those little pieces, once I said, oh yeah, that price right there, that's just for this big chunk right here. If we're going to break this down in an individual level, this is what it would look like. I did nothing in terms of understanding like what I changed nothing in terms of like the profit and loss, the cost of the revenue, nothing, none of that changed. How I sold it changed. And once I changed that slide and I sent it back, they're like, oh, okay, when can you start? I'm like, oh, geez, are you kidding me? Like, it was because I like took the thing and I packaged it in a different way. Like, the service didn't change at all, but the way that I talked about it did. And that became eminently more useful, and they were able to like hold that in their heads a little better. And so that's
Right.
what I learned in that process.
Right. Got it. Okay, cool. All right, so you went out, you started doing this business intelligence, right? You started gathering some intel, and you started to learn this resonated, that didn't resonate. They want this, they don't want that. They're willing to pay
Right.
this, not willing to pay that. And so you use that to continually evolve your hypothesis until you got something where as soon as it was in front of them, they were like, "Heck yeah, sign me up."
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So cool. So you start to get a Cockamamie idea. You go and do some research until you start getting like, okay, I'm getting some traction, getting some feedback here, getting consistent messaging from people. That's all. That's all well and good. What are some of the things, just high level? Because I know we spent a lot of time on the show talking about this before, but like, what are some of the things during this startup step one launch process that you have to look out for? What are the biggest pitfalls?
I feel like the biggest pitfall is not being open enough to thinking about the product in different ways, right? So for me, it was, hey, I have this big chunk. They didn't want to see the big chunk. They needed it little. And, I could have said, oh, they're just not my customer. It so happened that they were the only customer around. So I kind of had to be flexible, right? But in the broader sense, we are looking at things for, I have to start with why, right? I have to say, okay, this is what Dan is willing to do and what he's not willing to do. And this is what I'm about. This is what I'm not about. And I got to find those folks, right? That I actually resonate with. Yeah, there's a little bit of flexibility that has to go there. But notice, like with the past case, like I didn't change anything about the service. It was how I talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing in this phase is we're being flexible, not married to a particular configuration of the idea. Like we can see what the problem is. We know what the problem is. We probably know it better than the customer does. But that doesn't mean that the problem is like the way that we see it is actually the way that the customer is experiencing it. And
Right.
that is trying to figure out what we don't know, what we don't know. Really hard, right? Because we don't even know if there's a there. We can't even see it. We have to, like, the biggest challenge here is suspending belief that I have the solution, right?
Right. I like envisioning this process of trying to like line up the customer like wherever they are and whoever they are with what the product is, and they're both changing in real time. It's like this complex game of Pong,
Yeah,
where like you
right.
gotta like move the paddles around until you can
And the
actually keep
screen
them
is changing too, right?
right, and then the screen's moving, and right, it's a whole thing.
And you
So
get a wild card physics law change or something like that in the middle of it.
exactly, yeah, right. Yes,
Slippery.
exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Awesome. So success in this phase looks like, it looks like getting those signs of early traction. Like people are interested in this. This is cool. And so what are some of the resources? This is the stuff we talk about all the time, right? Like
Yeah.
this is lean startup. It's, business model generation, value proposition design, stuff like that.
Yeah, and Where to Play, which, oh, by the way, I got a copy of that book. I ordered it, and I have it, and haven't dug into it yet because I'm working on another book right now. But yeah, that's where all this stuff. That's where all this stuff fits in.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, all right. So that's step one. And for those of you just joining us, we are talking about how you know when to do what. And so we are walking through, or rather, Dan is walking us through this like 5-step process that goes from Cockamamie Scheme to IPO. And so you got it's broken down into 3 stages. We got launch, soft scale, and company, which are all about creating a startup. And then once you've proven that there's a there and it's a compelling business and all that stuff, then you move into the like company building part of this where you have like sales and leadership as their steps. So walk through this 5-step process. So that was launch. So next is soft scale. So let's start talking about how do you like what's the trigger for moving in from launch into soft scale?
Okay, so I feel like right here is so Lean Innovator is all about that step one. The right box is all about that step two. At least that's my impression of it, right? So what we're doing here, or what you're primarily doing, is you're telling people, hey, look, you've got a thing, and you've got a thing. Why? Because you have arguably a minimum viable product and people are giving you money for it. And so you maybe have formed a business entity and you're thinking about being scared about paying taxes, which, oh, by the way, little fun fact, you don't pay taxes on money you don't have. So taxes are not to be afraid of. Anyways, so what, some of the things that, what's the trigger here? It's sort of like, well, okay, we have a thing, we're selling it, we have customers, and life seems pretty cool. Like we think we're going to make it, right? And so what are we doing in this phase? We're talking with JDM, and he's telling us, he's like, okay, look, you have a slice of the market, but is it the right slice for you? And are you nailing it? Are you killing it? That kind of stuff. We're looking at right. Some of the exercises that you walk people through, like just give us an idea or two about like what that search for product market fit looks like.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I like how you set that up of like we have a slice of the market, but is it the right slice? Because I think what the mistake a lot of people make is that they're pretty narrow in how they view product market fit. And so you get some people who say product market fit is exclusively when you're like practically at IPO stage. And of course that's silly because you don't get to that stage without finding product market fit because it implies a certain amount of scale. But more often people are limiting the other direction. They say like, I got 5 customers and it wasn't hard, therefore I have product market fit. And that's also not true, right? It's like, no, you've got some compelling data. That's cool, right? But you don't have product market fit yet. And so the process that I view to like run through this to cross this particular chasm is to start figuring out, all right, so we left launch, like to use your terminology, Dan, like we left the launch phase. And so we've got a pretty good we know who our customers are. We got a pretty good hypothesis of where they are and how to find them because we've been talking to them. And we have an understanding of the problem is. So we went through the empathy process. So we did all that. And we have a pretty good hypothesis of what our solution is, and we've started to offer that to people in exchange for money, and it's kind of working. So that's a thing. So that's kind of where we are. So then the next step is to figure out, like, if we were to look at all of the properties that go into our organization, and there are 5 main properties that go into an organization, right?
I think right now I'm holding the bucket. I'm holding the bucket, trailing you
with the shovel.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So feel free to pull out any nuggets and share them with the audience. If you weren't with us at the beginning, that joke makes no sense to you, and you're welcome. So
gold, literally.
Right. So there are 5 like properties that we're looking at as part of any organization, as part of our hypothesis. Like when we talk about a product market hypothesis, we're talking about acquisition, activation, revenue, retention, and referral. So we're talking about those 5 properties of an organization. We have an hypothesis for all 5, but they're hypotheses, and we have greater or lesser data for each of those 5 hypotheses. And so now we find the riskiest ones and we start testing them, and we keep testing them until we have really compelling data on all of them. What does compelling data look like? Compelling data looks like if you throw our message, if you throw our value prop at the customer that we claim, they go through the process at a very predictable rate. We acquire them, they activate, they pay, they stay for the period of time we need them to stay with us, and they refer the people we need them to refer. And so that just kind of runs itself, right? That is product market fit. When you get that engine of your company kind of humming along and running smoothly.
And that's where it's predictable, right? So you could say, hey, if I put this amount of effort in and I pay this amount in acquisition costs, and it's gonna come out like a certain way.
Exactly. So
if I eat all the alfalfa, a couple gold nuggets will come out.
something like that. Yes. So Dan,
startup shop talk, y'all.
Continuing the metaphor. So yeah. So okay. So back in the day. So when Dan was doing his ISP in Baghdad, I was doing business intelligence for giant companies, and that meant business intelligence is roughly the acquisition of large amounts of data that we then make sense from. So there's a data analytics and reporting component to all of that. And working particularly in the sales and marketing aspect, you would say, okay, so we are expecting certain rates of, let's say, a cost per lead, right? In order to get a cost per lead, we have to have a cost there's probably say it's a digital ad, you have a cost per impression, right? And so you're like, okay, we're paying for a certain number of impressions, and then those impressions become leads, and so we have a cost per lead, and eventually we have a cost per sale, or whatever it is at the end of the day. And so you start looking at those metrics. And when you say predictable, it's when those aren't guesses, it's based on the data. They're coming in, and you know that if I were to, instead of spending $100 on impressions, if I were to spend $100,000 on impressions, that then I would just therefore get 1,000 times the number of customers, because it's that predictable, and it's just about putting more into it, because all of the metrics as you have along the way just become predictable, and they're only predictable because you keep acquiring data. Now, there's one caveat to that, which is that not only is it predictable, it also makes sense. So it doesn't matter if it's predictable and you would lose money, right? It needs to be predictable in a way that if you were to go from $100 to $100,000 of impressions, that it leads to a profitable company.
Right.
That's when you have product market fit. So that's the thing that you're actually going for to find out at the end of the day, is this thing worth doing? And so that's the exit, I would say, for this. Does that answer your question, Dan?
You know what? I think it does. To relate my own experience on that in Baghdad, it was okay. So basically, we put in the service, like we got the green light, we put it in. It cost us about $12,000 to get started, and it wasn't with the greatest equipment ever. It was pretty janky, actually. It looked cool, but that was about it. It didn't work really. It got the job done, right? It was certainly an MVP. And we got the network up and running. People started buying the service, and it was a lot of on the ground talking with customers. It was showing up to town hall meetings, being vulnerable and willing to say this is what was wrong with it. Because like nobody says I love my ISP. Nobody says that. They only say, hey, they're not too bad at fixing shit when it breaks, right? So we had that thing that we're looking for, but it was dialing that in and making sure that we had our, where technology failed, leadership shored the gap. In other words, customer service. We dialed in a lot of our processes using that data, so we knew for sure bandwidth cost was this. This is what we could expect people to use. This is when it could break. And we understood like all of those metrics so that we could have like, that predictability there. So it wasn't necessarily predictability on the sales so much as it was clawing a market share from the competitors. But we knew how many subscribers was actually going to tip the competitive balance in our favor. So that was more of my experience, but I think what we're getting at here, and this is what you were talking about, is when things become measurable and predictable, right? On both sides, on the sales side, but then also on the operational side.
Cool. So predictability is the game.
Yes.
Predictability is the game. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that's what success looks like in the soft scale phase here. Yeah. All right. And what are some resources that people should be looking at for soft scale? Like are there some books that can help? Like what should they be pulling from?
If I were to look at this, if I were to like type it in or whatever, I was just like running small business, like how to, optimize like an assembly line or something like that. Also, let's see, any of the books on product market fit. So you quoted Ash Moira, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Earlier. So I feel like his I mean, he's great for that first stage and this second stage as well. So I feel like those would be some good resources to kind of look at. Anybody talking about their, the business process as it's already established would be a good fit.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So, but you're saying here, we still don't care probably about how we build great sales processes or how we build great teams or how we right? We're not necessarily caring about that yet, right?
Not at this stage. I mean, it's great to be aware of it, but at this stage, that's not even a thing. Like, because we don't, it's not even a problem. Those conditions aren't even set yet.
So you're not, so with those conditions not set, you're not ready to read good to great.
I mean, you can, but not in the context of which the book is written. Right.
Got it. Right.
Yeah. So hard answer. No, you're not ready yet.
Okay, cool. All right. So that's So if we go back to our diagram here, so we've launched a company. There's a there. It's interesting. We moved into soft scale. We start finding product market fit. We got some good traction. It's like it's become repeatable at this point. So that's step 2 of our 3 startup steps. The third one being the startup company stage. This like primitive company building stage. So so that's the trigger, right? So now we got into the company building stage. What do you do in startup step 3?
Well, what's that 4-step small team process? It's storming, norming, conforming, and then performing. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Okay,
Yeah.
so here's the idea. When you have a group of people, what happens is everybody starts to fill the own role that they find themselves in, right? And it's not necessarily like these scripted out role like CEO, CTO, COO, and customer. Those are arbitrary labels that we give to the area of function that a person is that a person's performing. But what happens is you start to get people that become experts in their domains, right? And so the head of sales and marketing maybe becomes the expert in customer service or handling a particular problem that comes up every freaking time with your thing, right? And so as this is occurring, this person is developing not only as an individual, but as a person fulfilling a role in a team. So it's a little different. It's not necessarily job description so much as it is roles and responsibilities. There's a shades of gray there, right? Okay, so basically this person is stepping into their role and they're growing into their role as it is needed by the organization that's searching for this repeatable business model, right? And then you have other people doing the same thing. So they become like domain experts, they become leaders within the team. And so you can see it's this very predictable process that everybody goes through. Any small group goes through, whether it's a community that you're in, whether it is a company that you're building, whether it's your own family. You always go through these 4 phases. So the first phase is storming. It's basically everybody just trying to figure out who's doing what and who's comfortable doing what, right? And then the next phase is something called norming. It's basically once people have decided which role that they want to fill and how they can contribute to the team, what happens is they start to teach other people, hey, this is what I do, this is what I don't do, but this is what I do. So there's this thing called norming that happens around. And then after that, everybody like starts to understand, oh, okay, well, this is how we do stuff. And everybody sort of fits into those roles. And the idea is conforming then at that point, right? So conforming is basically saying, okay, well, I'm going to fit within these roles and I know where my limits are and I know where your limits are and I know what I can do and what you can do. And so the final thing that happens is everybody's comfortable with this. Everybody's on the same sheet. We're all like, we are functioning as a machine. And that's when we start doing the thing called performing, right? So this phase of the startup journey is all about, like, it's all very much in flux, right? And we're all sort of like trying to go through this thing because, oh, by the way, it's not just about the team on the startup, but it's also about the relationship with the startup and the customers, and maybe the startup and the vendors, right? So fractals, right? Concentric circles of influence that we're talking about. So in this whole team building, there are all these different like activities that we're going to be doing. We're always having to try to sell, always. We're always trying to, take care of the customers, always that front facing stuff. But we're also always looking at operations, if, making operations a little more efficient, understanding like our vendor relationships, our service provider relationships, all those things, right? And so those particular activities bespeak needs that actually exist as well. So what do I need to do, in that particular, like in a particular area? Well, I always need to be closing. I always need to be interviewing customers. I always need to make sure that I'm like managing expectations, taking care of them, all that kind of stuff. That's on the front of the house stuff. On the back of the house stuff, I always need to make sure that I'm out there looking for other people to hire, interviewing people like a year before I even think about needing that role, right? Because I'm just getting to know them, I'm networking, that kind of thing, right? Now, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden I need to brush up on HR law. But what this does mean is that, right, I just need to like follow people and track people around and be like, I mean, not in a stocky way, but like in a way that like, so that, we maintain, debatable according to JDM. But it's so that so that I kind of have my finger on the pulse of this available pool of folks, so that I'm not, because people don't come in vending machines, right?
Hmm.
We're all part of fabric. We're all part of networks that are always changing, and so that's the idea there. And so personally, then what I'm always doing is I'm always setting the example as a potential, or as the leader inside of the startup, of like, this is a story of a time where I faced this particular dilemma and this is what I did, or this is the story of somebody else and how they acted properly and all that kind of stuff. So I'm teaching. So I'm guiding this small team that I have, like the startup team, through these 4 phases. But then I'm also guiding how we react to other people on the production side, on the customer side, and then on the financial side. So those are the activities.
Okay. All right. Cool. So, so that's kind of a lot, and it's starting to get a little bit more sprawling at this point,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
because
It's like
we're
there's
getting bigger, sure.
right. So we're getting bigger, and so we're not no longer focused on like who is the customer, who is the product, like
Yeah,
how do we connect the two, instead of
I
like
mean,
fig.
yeah, I was
I
just
mean,
gonna
it's
say,
not
like,
that we don't care, but it's like we care about that, and we care about like we got sales now, we got a team now, we've got like a real company. We have to start caring about taxes and accounting, and like there's some shit that we got to start thinking about that would be a waste of time to think about earlier on, because they have a lot more to do with efficiency and a lot less to do with effectiveness.
yeah, totally. So we noticed that the conversations actually change. The conversations themselves morph, right?
Hmm.
And so the books that we're reading at this point, they need to morph as well, right? So that's certain, that like now we're starting to like illustrate why like there's a certain timing for things. Just like to your point, Josh, it's that
Right.
we've added layers onto this thing, and so now we're having different conversations, and there's different things that are at stake.
Right. Okay, cool. So, all right. So that's sort of how you get here, what you do during it. Like it's starting to sound like, well, this is everything. This is just what a company does. But we still got 2 steps left. So, like, how do you get
Like,
out of
what the
like what
hell?
is the yeah, so what is the how do you get out of this step? Like where are we heading?
Okay, so at this point, let me illustrate with the Baghdad story. So at this point, I
Cool.
had customers, I had subscribers, like, and I think we capped out at about 400 subscribers each, right? And we were paying them, they were paying monthly, we were giving them the service monthly, seeing, you know, going and fixing technical problems, of which there were many. Um,
Yeah. There always
hard,
are.
oh my goodness, hardware, connectivity, Baghdad. Come on, there was always something to do. To quote Forrest Gump. Um, so so where were we at this point? It was, hey, I had a team, I had a person that was a receptionist, and I had like the technical people, right, that would go and respond to customer service calls. But they didn't quite know what Western customer service looked like. In other words, the rest of the world is pretty sane where it comes to servicing customers. It's like, hey, whatever's within reason. In the United States, at least this is Dan's experience, Western customer services, hey, let me bend over backwards so that my back cracks a little bit, and let me bend over a little bit more because customers always right, right? Just the way it is. Um, okay, so so I had a team that was used to serving adequately, and I was like, no, that's not how we're going to win market share from these competitors. We need to be better, because the internet service itself, it was the same. We were getting from the same source. The service was the same, but how we treated the customers were going to be different. That was our differentiator. And so I needed to take these folks that weren't used to Western customer service. And I said, okay, I had to teach them, number one, this is what it looks like. But then number two, I know you don't like it and it's sucky, but we got to do it anyways. And this is why. So
Mm,
basically, the activities were setting standards, reinforcing those standards, and making sure, you know like a gentle wind blows clouds, because you can't blow too hard or they'll scatter, right? So I had to maintain some sort of gentle force there, but making sure that I was constantly reinforcing like things that they did right, and minimizing the things that weren't so right. And so it was a very soft touch that I had to apply, sometimes a little stronger, but it was mostly catching flies with honey rather than vinegar, in terms of setting that whole thing up.
right. Okay. Cool. All right. I'm with you now. So the exit to this particular point
I'm glad you
is
brought it back. Yeah.
yes. So so what does it look like? Like when you say like, all right, yeah, we've got a thing here. We're no longer a startup, right? So you opened with Steve Blank. You said that a startup is an organization in search of a business model. So at this point, we have a business model. So last stage, we found product market fit. This stage, we started like building out the team. So we now have a business model with a thing that's starting to coalesce around it.
Yeah.
And now it's just time to double down.
Kinda. Yeah. So let me introduce a concept called the Casas-Murillo's hierarchy of sales. Um, so let's look at this.
Oh,
So
fancy
let
illustration.
I get paid the big bucks for this. Okay, so this is what we'll call the hierarchy of sales. At the very bottom, let's say that, and this is a common trajectory, at least that I've found. At the very bottom here, we have our foundational sales. These are the business to customer sales, right? This is Dan with his partner providing the internet service to individual subscribers. And then what happens is sales kind of grow, but they don't grow necessarily in volume alone. They grow in configuration. What I mean by that is that at some point we had subscribers on the base, but then we had individual companies outside the base wanting their own dedicated internet. And it costs a little bit more and there was more to do. And, it was like a custom solution, right? So that's when sales turned into B2B sales. Now, the final version that we'll talk about a little bit later is what I'd like to call the enterprise level of sales. And it was basically like, okay, well, if these are individual subscribers, these were companies, what was this? Well, this was like governments, defense contractors, all that other kind of stuff, right? These are folks that are looking for more than just the basic service, right? But as we go up the hierarchy, we can see that one level reinforces the next. So the B2C sales was basically social proof for the companies so that I could move into that B2B tier. And those individual companies were actually proof that I could execute on like an enterprise level contract. So what's the trigger here? Like, what does it look like when we're done with this phase and we're rolling into the next one? Well, I would say let revenues actually define that. So, I feel like at this point, like in a business to customer startup, like more revenues mean just more volume, right? Just more types of that same stuff over and over and over again. But what I found is that not just with the ISP, but like with other companies, is that at some point you can make a decision. You're like, hey, I love these individual sales, but I'm wondering if there are businesses that could benefit from what I'm doing. Right. And so I would argue that once I have my company up and running, I'm at this inflection point, right? Am I going to continue up that hierarchy of sales or I'm going to stay where I'm at right now? Now that's up to the founder, that's up to the company and the market ultimately to decide like how that's actually going to go. But it can totally go vertical. And so, so that basically the indicator is allow the customers to dictate. So if your customer starts changing, if there's more attractive, like you're able to offer more for more, or the customer wants a bigger package and they're willing to pay you money for that, and you're okay with that, and that's within your company's DNA. The trigger is basically like understanding, hey, are there more people that can sustain us easier here, right? And I feel like when we get there, it's kind of it makes sense at the time, right? It's not one of those. It's like art of war, right? Like the battlefield is always changing, and you have to be flexible to like different environments and conditions and stuff like that. So by the same token, as the founders looking at the field of battle, right? Like the customer landscape is always changing, and so that's sort of like where we're finding ourselves now, and
All right.
at this particular stage.
All right, cool. So we have about 11 minutes left in our show and two more stages to get through.
Oh, I thought
So
I thought I was on the fourth one already. Can we say I was on the fourth one?
yeah, sure. You were on the fourth one.
You're like, thanks, Dan. My
So
bad.
let's all right. So let's do quick tease out of these two things. All right.
Please.
So when we were in startup, so startup step one, we had this idea of launch, right? And so we had an idea, we got it out there, we started getting some interesting responses. Our hypotheses started to solidify, but there was still hypotheses. But it's like there's a there, but they're hypotheses. So then we move into startup step two, which is the soft scale. So we start doing some really structured experiments on this. We start building real things as opposed to fake things. We start doubling down. Eventually, we find product market fit, meaning that we have something that a defined group of customers want. And if we throw money at it, we get predictable results, and those results are attractive. So then we start moving on from there into startup step three, the final of the startup stages, where you start building out a team and kind of doing that process and start learning. And the conversation kind of shifts a bit into how do we support this business model, because we know what it is. Now it's just about how do we support it, because we've probably been doing a lot of non-scalable things, and start to think about how do we do those scalable things and move into, is it really feasible? And so then we move into the fourth stage, which is the first non-startup stage, which is, okay, we have to, we want to figure out how we grow our skills, how we get beyond this. Are we going to become the next Uber, in that we could just do this thing, but for the world, and make tons of money? Or are we going to need to find, do we storm the beach and kind of get in there, but now it's time to change our tactics and maybe move up the sales ladder, or whatever, right? We got to figure out, what is our play here? Are we on the right path for us that maximizes the opportunity, or do we need to make a little shift? And so that's where we're in this step four. And you're saying that the path out of this step four, this sales step, is based on the company, but it is are we on the right path? If we know that this is the play that our company is going to make, then we're going to triple down, I guess, at this point, and move into the leadership phase. Otherwise, we're going to spend some time pivoting around a little bit until we do get to, this is the thing, that this is our company. We thought it was this, which was great and good, but it's really this. And then once we get there, then we can move on.
Yeah. In fact, I did misspeak earlier. I said, "Oh yeah, I thought that was step four." It turned out that we're on the precipice of step four. So let's talk about step four real quick, but it's short. It's basically the idea that we're in this fourth step here. We're in the in between land, right? And it's okay, well, in order to grow sales, what do we do? Do we raise money because we need more inventory and we need to increase the amount of things that we're out in the costs and all that kind of stuff, or do we try to sell more? And it's like a chicken to the egg thing, right? It's hey, wait a minute, I need more money so I can sell more, but I need to sell more so I can get more money, right? Or you have a different problem. You have so many customers that you can't keep up with the demand, right? And so in either case, you have this concept, or this condition of what I like to call metered growth, right? And so it's at this point, it's not necessarily about growing as fast as you can. At least this is Dan's opinion, right? It's not about growing as fast as you can. It's about balancing things as you progress. So the customers are the ones that drive this whole process, right? Because that's the way it is. So the customers, let's say, for example, that they're they're demanding more, or they are from businesses, or they're from enterprise, whatever, it doesn't matter. Wherever they're at, they're starting to demand you provide them with a particular service and that kind of thing, right? And so what you, as the founder, need to do now at this stage, you're no longer a startup, you're a company. And so what you have to do is make sure that you're balancing everything out. Do we have the capacity to actually meet this demand? Do we have the finances to cover the costs that we will incur in the very beginning? If we don't, where can we get the money? And oh, by the way, how soon can we get it back? And will that make sense for us? Will that generate a profit eventually? What about the people? Do we have the available people? What about supplies, like supply chain, right? It's a thing. So can we actually execute on all this stuff that we're promising? It's a very fine balance. When I was doing the ISP, there were a couple of times where it was just too much. I couldn't do it. Somebody would say, "Hey, we want a circuit over here. We want a circuit over there." I was like, you gotta give me a month or two before I'm ready for this, because I just can't. I'm going to do a bad job if I do it for you. And I lost a customer that way. They went with somebody else, but the company remained intact. The company remained intact. My team remained a team, my partner was still my partner. You know what I mean? Like as the business development slash lead of the company, I had to make sure that things were balanced. Because if they hadn't, then that could mean the death of the company, right? Or at least going in a way that I couldn't support later on. So I feel like step 4 is mostly about, like what I said, metered growth. If there's nothing else that anybody walks away with for this particular step, it's about balancing everything, keeping that there, right? And so that's where that it's different conversation, right? It's not growing teams, it's like maintaining teams and then balancing those factors with external factors and that kind of stuff. So that's step 4.
Got it. All right, cool. So, Dan, take us into the 5th and final stage here, growth stage number 2, leadership.
Okay, so basically at this point, you've got the company, it's established, you've got customers, they're happy, you have a thing, it's predictable, you have sales, all those things, right? And maybe on the hierarchy of sales, maybe you've progressed up through B2B to enterprise, right? So now conversations change again. And it's more about understanding the bigger pieces that are moving in the market. It's about understanding the bigger competitor moves based on those bigger pieces in the market. And so we're talking about like not just your customers, but also the people that are affected, like market, like call them market forces, right? It's basically like people that affect your customers' decisions, lawmakers, other companies, conditions like the weather, all that stuff that all kind of fits into how things are going. And so knowing where to position yourself is predicated on you knowing the actual conditions in the environment. And so you're focused on different stuff like economics, macroeconomics, like becomes a thing, like why the price of oil is so high and how that relates to my sale of widgets or cupcakes later on. Right. So for the internet service provider, the conversations were more like this. It was like, oh, the Ministry of Communications just passed a policy in Parliament, and that policy says that residential internet service providers must exist with these particular restrictions. Oh shit, we don't meet some of those restrictions, so we need to figure out what to do. Do we find a different customer? Do we comply? Do we find the right person to like give us some wiggle room? Something like that. Or do we change our business model completely? Or like do we change the supply chain completely so that we can comply with the actual policy but still deliver the that service, right? All this stuff is going on and it's wacky, right? And oh, by the way, at this point now you have maybe new people coming in to help with the work, new employees, and you've got to integrate them with the old culture. And then you've got that old culture needs to change to accommodate those new folks. And so you've got all these different things happening at the same time. So you as a leader at this point, now your job isn't making the widget. It's not understanding, it's not focusing so much on understanding customers. It's understanding the people that are understanding the customers, making sure that that is actually still occurring, but you're guiding now instead of actually like working the machine. So that's that stage.
Cool. All right. So this makes sense. We only have 2 minutes left.
Duh.
So I would like to ask a provocative question and then just have you give a really quick answer. All right.
Challenge
So
accepted.
we started this by saying that founders are often given the wrong advice for the time. Not that it's bad advice. It's just not really helpful for where they are right now.
Right.
So they're reading these books way in this leadership sales phase. They're reading this material that's really helpful for when they get much further along in the journey. So here's my provocative question. Are those founders going to get there?
That's a great question. And the likelihood is no.
Ay, Dios mío. Are you saying that they're going to fail?
No, mijo, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
Okay.
that there's an evolution. There's this progression path, right? And you made a point earlier, which was that basically we're in the culture of firing founders, right?
Ah, right.
Why don't you expand on that for a second?
All right. So my quick take on this is that like founding a company and running a company are two dramatically different skills.
Forsooth.
And if you're good at one, you're not necessarily good at the other, because they're literally very, very different. And so what often happens in the life cycle of a company is that you will you'll be a brilliant founder, and you'll create this amazing thing, and you'll prove it. Like, you'll get to the point where there is a there, and you got a business model, and now the organization, now it's just about, it's about scaling. Now it's time to raise $20 million and like blow it up, as opposed, like, it's there, you've got millions in revenue, but now it's time to blow it up. And oftentimes at that point, this is where you talk about firing the founder, Dan. Like, we'll literally, like, we'll replace the founder. He'll keep his equity, sure, but like, we replace him with somebody who knows how to run really big companies, who knows how to scale big companies, because it's a very different skill. But that person is also probably not great at being a founder, because they're very different skills. So even if it's the wrong stage, it's not necessarily for you. And so I think the question that people should be asking themselves who are reading this information out of order is, what do they want? Do they want to do this work that you're talking about here, Dan, and like create an amazing thing out of nothing, create value where before there was none? Or instead, do they want to run a company? Because if they just want to run a company, there's a very different path to do that. And it's not this one. There are exceptions. There are lots of exceptions to that. Like, some founders go on to make great CEOs eventually, but it is a small minority. And it's not necessarily the goal that you should be going, that you should be going after.
Nicely said. I have nothing to add to that.
Well, great. So we'll call it then. Thanks so much for joining us here on Startup Shop Talk, our weekly live show about all things startup and innovation, from idea all the way to product market fit. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button, be notified about our upcoming shows, click the little bell, do all of that. We are going to be back next Friday, March 4th at 11 a.m. So see you all there. But for now, Dan, where can people find you on the internet?
You can legit just Google Dan Costas Murray. It's a very unique name, and there it is. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. What about you?
All right. Well, you can find me at jdm.bio. Just tap that into the URL bar, and all will be good to go. Subscribe to my newsletter, weekly tip on startup and innovation, or you can just hit me up on LinkedIn. All's great there. So that's it for us today, and I will see you guys, and see you, Dan, next week.
See you guys later. Thank you.